You've got red blood, white fangs, deep cleavage, evil eyes, night violence, Hammer Films, Dracula from 1958, or Horror of Dracula in the United States, changed the Dracula game. Tonight we're going to talk about how.
Let's talk about how. This is my first. This is my first viewing of any Hammer horror film, and I know Hammer got into the game in the late '60s, early '70s. The Wolfman, the Werewolf. They did Frankenstein. They did the Mummy, but they're probably best known for the combination of Peter Cushing as Van Helsing and Christopher Lee as Count Dracula. And I gotta say, I was really excited and a bit disappointed by the final product because I think both Cushing and Christopher Lee are so much better than these films. It's sad. I guess you can wait too long to see a film so that when you finally get to it, it just doesn't live up to your expectations. Now, is that my fault or is that the film's fault? You can equally divide that, I think, because there have been films that have delivered.
Really fucked up.
No,
Christopher for being born too early, you know.
Maybe Christopher Lee is definitely not the problem here. Christopher Lee elevates this film. Peter Cushing elevates this film. I think the problem is in direction, where it's not dark enough. It's not, the stakes are not high enough, or at least they're not dramatically played strong enough. And I think that's the problem with this film. And it makes me it kind of makes me sad. But I will continue. There are 7 Hammer Dracula films with Christopher Lee returning as Dracula, and I think it's one of those situations where I will watch the films no matter what, for the simple fact that Christopher Lee is in them and he delivers, and he is brilliant in this. I think he might be the second greatest Dracula ever put on screen, and it's sad that Bela Lugosi beat him 30 years to the punch, 40 years to the punch, because Christopher Lee does so much with so little. And the story is that Christopher Lee read the script and said, I can't say these lines. These lines are fucking stupid. I think the thing is that with this, Christopher Lee basically said, I can't speak these lines. I'm not going to speak these lines. And I think it elevated the performance in the film, you know? And you were saying?
Because I was saying that it reminds me of Alec Guinness from Star Wars, where you have these English actors with great training who are used to, Shakespeare and different caliber of language. And so they end up saying less, or they modify, and then it almost gives it, like, in that sense, I mean, I guess the American version would be Steve McQueen or a Clint Eastwood is
Eastwood,
like, I'm not going to fucking say these lines, not because they're not Shakespeare, but just because the less I say, the more action-oriented I become. And this is kind of that, because this is late 50s this is the modern, it's in color.
Is this 58 or 68? This is 58?
I think it's 58.
Okay, 58, yeah.
It all comes down to it comes down to Christopher Lee and what differentiates him from what came before and what would come after. Let's look at the major Dracula films. So Nosferatu, Silent Era, 22.
Yeah.
Shrek.
Yeah.
Max Shrek. Animalistic, rat-like, grotesque.
Wait a minute. What was that?
Animalistic,
okay,
rat-like, and grotesque.
Yeah.
That's that. Jump forward to 31, Todd Browning's Dracula.
Yeah.
Obviously, Bela Lugosi's is the classic. That's the iconic, refined,
The bar.
Eastern European Dracula. Yeah. And with the exception of, separate that from the, because we haven't even gone into the Spanish language version of that film.
No.
Which is, for a later time. But Lugosi's that's the one. That's the one that everyone thinks about, whether they know it or not. That's the Sesame Street Count. That's the fucking Count Chocula.
Yeah.
That's all the cereal box shit. That's that. The cape, all of it.
Yeah. Cartoons and costumes. That is what we think of when we think of Dracula. Right.
Then we get Christopher Lee. Let's skip him real quick to come back because this is what we're doing. 79, we get a Frank Langella. We get some other ones too, but that one's more smooth, more sexual.
Yeah.
79, also you get Klaus Kinski and Nosferatu the Vampire. So you get a Herzog reimagining of the original Nosferatu with Shrek, only this time there is a sexuality attached to it. There's more intimidating, more overwhelming, more violent, more threatening.
Yeah.
And it's also because it's Klaus Kinski. And that's what we're talking about, the performances. Then fast forward to the early 90s, you get Bram Stoker's Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola. Gary Oldman, more versatile in terms of his look, but a mixture of old world, but also seemingly modern. Everything that came after Christopher Lee, that I just mentioned, so Frank Langella's performance, Klaus Kinski's, Gary Oldman's, I think in terms of the cinema of it, I don't know about the performances because I doubt that Klaus Kinski was influenced by fucking anyone other than fucking his own madness. To include Werner Herzog, who I think didn't really probably have that much control over him. Except, if you leave the set, I'll kill you. For a different film, but that's in general. Christopher Lee, first of all, this film, there's a lot of hype, I guess, that you felt with this film, and it's kind of connects with the previous.
Well, I had grown up with this, yeah.
And it's weird because it's growing up with it without having seen it.
Yeah.
Which is, this pop cultural shit of it. Plus, I saw this and I was like, I've seen this movie. And I was watching this and I'm like, I think part of the problem for me was that it was not problem, but the confusion was, it's kind of like early Beatles. The names of the albums for the early Beatles are different in the UK than they are in the US. Or it's like early Bruce Lee movies. Same shit. Where you're like, well, is this Fist of Fury? Is this whatever, right?
Yeah.
Is this Dracula, 1958, or is this Horror of Dracula? So I'm like, I've seen this movie. And then I was questioning, I feel like we've talked about this on some level, but you say you haven't seen it, so I'm like, it's just
weird.
We've
talked about the pop culture aspect of, we've done 4 episodes on vampires, or we've mentioned vampires prominently in at least 4 episodes. So it's the pop culture nature, and Christopher Lee, second only to Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee is who you think of when you talk about Dracula. It's the go-to.
He's part of it, yeah, and you also think of him as having he's the successor of Bela Lugosi.
Yeah.
You watch this film, it's in color. You're not waiting that long before you see Christopher Lee grab a female vampire, one of his brides or whatever, throw her to the floor, fucking her cleavage is out, her fangs are out, he's all pissed off, his fucking teeth are bloody, and he's almost, do you remember that, we watched a documentary on Black horror.
Yeah.
I think it was called Horror Noir.
Yeah.
And it was about African-American horror cinema. And I don't remember the actor's name, but she was talking about how she's in some other, I think it's the girl who was in The Craft.
Yeah.
she's talking about Blackula, and she was like, Blackula was more, and when I'm thinking about it, it almost sounds like, had someone else said it, you could say that those were stereotypes that person was applying to it.
Yeah.
Because it was like, oh, more virile, more. She didn't say animalistic, but she said more virile, more manly, more strong. Like all of that type of shit. And then it's like, okay, that the white Draculas or whatever were. It almost, in hindsight, sounded like she was saying like they were like more effeminate. And I think that's just more because of the refined whatever, but they just weren't badass enough. Whereas this guy, but Christopher Lee to me was also virile, but cold as fuck. He was almost like an English pimp to me, because he was almost like, bitch. And he fucking throws it to the floor, and I was just like, whoa, like this shit fucking. And I had already seen it, but I that's when I'm like, oh, I saw this. But it was still surprising to me that it got fucking like that it escalated that quickly. And that it was like, oh, this is fucking like this is not just a woman's hysterical in a film until a male character slaps her. You know what I mean?
Although
like,
that does happen at one point.
Well, yes, but what I mean is typically that's what you're gonna see like in 50s, right?
Yeah.
This is like, no, bitch, like I'm the boss. I'm gonna kill him. Don't forget your place. I'm gonna throw you to the floor. Now I'm gonna kill you off camera, and I'm gonna fucking carry your corpse outside, and I'll deal with you later, motherfucker. Also, bitch. You know what I mean? He was like, you know what I mean? Like it's. You go from Bela Lugosi. Obviously, there's a lot of time in between, but it's like, whoa. Christopher Lee is a violent motherfucker in this film. It's not just, I'm going to use my persuasive vampire powers to seduce you. He's going to fight you. There was a coldness to it, a violence to it, but still a sexuality that I think influenced at least Langella and Gary Oldman. He was kind of the bridge between what would come and what was before. It was very, very unique, and his voice.
Yeah.
He still, he looked young, but at the same time felt old, which is the same thing. It's kind of like the bridge between what came before and what's in the future.
Well, we've talked about that. That's the gravitas. That's he has that. He has an instantly watchable personality. Carries himself in a way where your eye is drawn to him. And there's a part of me that was upset at how little he is in the film. But maybe that's a good thing, because when he is on film, when he is in the scene, he's captivating. You can't pay attention to anything else. And it was surprising to me.
Like Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was surprising to me, because I'm coming to this completely from simply a pop culture aspect, as you pointed out. I was not prepared to see Peter Cushing as the star. And you see that in the credits, starring Dracula, starring Peter Cushing. And then you see the other ones, this person and this person, with Christopher Lee as Dracula. And that kind of threw me for a fucking loop. And as I was watching this film, I was really into both Cushing and Lee. But I also kind of got the impression, and I was wondering if you got it as well, because I'm not familiar with their acting background. I'm not sure. We have we have stage in the English tradition. You have Sir Ralph Richardson's, John Gielgud. You have Burton, Peter O'Toole, Richard Harris. They were all stage actors, and they developed their craft on the stage and came out of that into film.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, what was Cushing and Cushing and Christopher Lee more like the Harrison Fords of their time, where they weren't stage actors, they were made on film. I don't know what their history is in that respect, and it kind of shocked me that, because I was like, I started thinking about that. I was like, were these guys slumming, or were they? I kind of got the sense that this is a lowbrow type of filmmaking, and it didn't have the prestige of what more highly respected actors of the English theater would be, or those English actors that had transitioned to film. And I was wondering about that. I was wondering, I mean, maybe you know more than I do on this one, but what did Cushing and Christopher Lee come from? Because also, as far as I know, they were both primarily horror actors. They didn't do the prestige drama, you know?
That's an interesting question, because like even earlier I was talking about how the English actors, like an Alec Guinness, who is classically trained.
Yeah.
I don't know that these people are like the two biggies in England are the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art and the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art.
Is it the Royal Academy or Royal Shakespearean Academy? I can't remember what.
No. It's Lambda and Rada.
Okay.
And so they have all this training, but still, in English culture, you have more of that tradition in general of these Elizabethan writers, and then later these Victorian writers, and also like just like this genre is so much of like the Gothic genre is also English. Whether the stories themselves are taking place in somewhere else, it's still, you know what I mean? Like English or thereabouts, whether it's Bram Stoker of Irish descent, whatever. So it's an interesting question, because Hammer doesn't seem. The question is like, because I do want to explore more of this shit. Like, is Hammer? Is it more of? Was it like
Corman?
Yeah. Is it like B movie, or is it kind of like specific to these kind of films? And the remaking, is it kind of like their answer to Universal, but only like on a certain level, to a certain budget? Like, we're gonna do Frankenstein. We're gonna stay within the framework of the Gothic. You know what I mean? Is it that? And how did these guys wind up doing this and kind of like staying into that? Because it's not like, you think of Hopkins, you think of Ian McKellen, you think of Patrick Stewart. A lot of these people Patrick Stewart gains pop cultural fame as Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? But at the same time, he's a very great and capable actor. Anthony Hopkins obviously has done all kinds of shit. His most iconic role is Lecter. You get this tradition of English villains, and people with English accents in historical dramas or fantasy, or whether it's Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or any of these types of films. And one thing that you'll hear is that they can pull it off because they're able to ground it in this classical training, and they do have, as you often describe, this gravitas that allows for them to be experienced as intimidating, having dignity to such a degree that you're in awe of them, you're afraid of them, but you respect them. All of that. I don't know. I don't know what. I don't know a lot about. I know Christopher Lee was in the military, and there's that that story about him. Who was it that he told
Peter
him
Jackson?
That's not? Yeah, Peter Jackson. Tell that story.
Well, the story is that Peter Jackson wanted to do a scene where a man was stabbed in, I think, in the lung from the back, and he was going to make this noise. And Christopher Lee said, "No, we're not going to do that." And Peter Jackson said, "Why not?" He was like, "Have you ever seen a man stabbed in the back?" And Peter Jackson said, "No." And he was like, "They don't make that kind of sound." It's like, oh, how fucking scary is that? and Christopher Lee was in his 80s at that point, so it's like you're sitting there like, wait a minute, this motherfucker is not to be trifled with. This is the real deal. I mean, he was Christopher Lee was cousins with Ian Fleming. And some of what James Bond is based on Christopher Lee to a degree. And Christopher Lee would talk about he knew these people that that Fleming wrote into the novels. Like he knew a Blofeld. He knew a guy named Blofeld who Fleming based these characters on. Christopher Lee spoke many languages. He was a spy, a soldier. He had to tell the truth, Christopher Lee as an actor was slumming in life based on what he had been up until the point of getting into pictures. So it's really interesting. The man, and people speak of him in such a kind way. They don't speak of him as an asshole. They don't speak of him as egotistical or above all else. And the man obviously had a sense of humor about what he did, because why else would he do Gremlins 2, The New Batch, and spoof Dracula in that film? That's one of the biggest laughs. If you know Christopher Lee, and you see the film and you see him as that mad scientist, and the Dracula moment, the vampire gremlin moment, it's fucking hilarious if you know the history of Christopher Lee and how tongue in cheek that is. And the man just seemed cool as fuck. He just seemed like one of those guys where infinitely watchable. And I think his, I don't even know if it's his performance or it's his mere presence in this film elevates this, because my problem with the film is the direction. It's too brightly lit, and the tension is not allowed to build the way that it should. And it's not, there's so much there that is not expanded on. The sexuality that you mentioned is brought by Christopher Lee, but it's not really, there's not a lot done with it as far as the picture is concerned, and that's a problem with the director. If you watch Lucy in her bed, she's excited. She wants this motherfucker to come over here and take her. There is a palpable sexual tension in this film, and Lee provides that in a way that the handsome quality that Frank Langella would bring to the New York set Dracula of 2 decades later. That's, I mean, you know, Dracula as a story, there is a very powerful sexual content there. I'm pretty sure Bram Stoker wrote that in. I'm pretty sure that he identified it and wrote it in. But the Hays Code being what it was, and the moral standards of all of those of the periods in which these films were made would not allow certain subjects to be broached, you wouldn't really see the power of what was possible. I mean, there was that moment in John Carpenter's Vampires where Thomas Ian Griffith as the vampire is basically going down on Cheryl Lee. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he
Yeah.
doesn't bite her on the neck. He bites her on the inner thigh. And it's like, leave it to John Carpenter to take advantage of the falling, the falling cinematic regulations and actually just go for it in something. It's, when you see that, it's kind of hinted at in there, in this Dracula film. And I think with the level of Christopher Lee's sexiness and his quality, that virile thing that you were talking about in comparison to horror noir, Christopher Lee brings that to it. And it's very powerful. He's the best thing about this movie. And his screen time is what? Maybe 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe, you know. This film is about
This movie, him and Cushing.
Yeah. I mean, I watched the movie and I'm captivated by Cushing, who really looks like he's slumming. He really looks like he's slumming. Like he's showing up. But it also seems to me it's like the success of the movie showed him what a payday this would be. And I'm really interested in seeing the flowers that grow out of this seed. Because I don't know these films. I don't know the Hammer films and I don't know their work. I know them. It's weird. I know them from pop culture and the references to them and interviews that each of them have done. And I find both of them captivating. Watching Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in talk show interviews is really, but all of those guys. Peter O'Toole is a great guest.
Oh yeah.
Richard Harris. I mean, I could sit there and watch Richard Harris. There are sometimes when you punch in Richard Harris and Peter O'Toole into the search engine on YouTube, and there'll be like 3 hours worth of those guys sitting down. Yeah. Telling drinking stories, telling movie making stories, flirting with the host. It's unbelievable how just how much they made you want to watch them. You can't teach that. It really comes down to what the fuck else would those guys have done with their lives if they weren't movie stars. But they weren't just movie stars. That just to call them movie stars would diminish both their work and their talent. They were movie stars and great actors at the same time. And that's what you see that with these guys. When I say that the movie itself was a disappointment, I stand on that. Because the tension and the what I'm looking at isn't as powerful as Todd Browning's. It doesn't even approach what Todd Browning created. But it's infinitely watchable every time Christopher Lee is on screen. And in that moment where Peter Cushing really goes after him when they're fighting at the end, I really got out of I kind of got out of the chair. I moved forward. I leaned forward. I stared at the screen. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? And it was exciting. And I love that. I love when a movie can disappoint you for as long as that movie did, and then turn it on its end. And now I'm captivated. We talked a little bit about going, in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about going back to a film for certain scenes. That final confrontation between Cushing and Christopher Lee is just incredible. I love it. And the way they're going. Those red contacts that Christopher Lee is wearing that he hated. And the danger that he brings even on the floor as Cushing is coming at him and he's created that cross. That's when the movie got really exciting for me. And I wish the whole thing had been to that level. Maybe not in the level of excitement, but I wish the earlier part of the film had been as powerful as that end. That was all in all, loved watching it, but couldn't help but think, God, this could have been better. Nah, this fucking thing could have been better.
It's all about kind of getting to those. In a sense, it's kind of like pornography, like a porn, like the porn scripts the porn films that had scripts, where you would have some kind of premise, and then you would shoot a setup, and then you would have a sex scene, and then you would have another setup, and then you would have a sex scene. This is how it felt to me, because it was just kind of like, it was all setups for more action. It was almost, or in that sense, almost like a kung fu movie too.
I got that sense at one point, yeah.
Where it's like, well, we're going to talk now, and then now is a fight scene. And now we're going to talk. And then that's how this was, where it was just like, talk, vampire attack, talk, potential vampire attack. And it just seemed to move quickly for the purposes of getting to those scenes.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times when you have that kind of dichotomy between like setup and action of whatever type, I think our minds, maybe now, I mean, the opposite argument is like, okay, good, the setup allows you to take a break and rebuild. I didn't feel like this did that. I just felt like it was like, well, can we just have the highlights cut where it's just all the action only?
Yeah.
And I think with a different kind of approach, because it felt like, it's like, this is what you're training me to want, because this is what I'm getting. And so this is kind of like, I feel like you want me to wait for the action scene. Whereas a different type of film that was maybe more of a talky kind of like or mumblecore, as they would call it, is like, okay, we're just sitting in this. Okay. The hits are in the dialogue. We're just going to sit now. So I felt that the film was communicating with me basically to, like, the rhythm of it was almost like on, off, rather than the tide coming in, going out. I felt that was the rhythm. So in that sense, it although it did move quickly, it was kind of like, I'm only left with the action scenes, and really I'm only particularly left with the scene where the female vampire attacks Harker, and Dracula kills her, and then the scene where in the end where it's where Dracula dies. And watching him become a pile of ash, and what happens to his foot. And so in that sense, it's kind of like, that's the movie to me. Everything else is just a variation of what we all know to be the basic Dracula story, which is Harker goes to the castle for whatever purpose. It changes for different reasons.
Depending on the
Here he's a librarian. He's going to catalog these books.
He's posing as a librarian.
That's an interesting thing too.
And that should have been explored.
That was an interesting one. Is that, like, he's already on a mission. Um, and so that by the time you get, once he fails in that mission, and it's like, oh, you fucked up, like they got you, so that it means more. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of okay, same shit. Keanu Reeves, whether it's him or anyone else, it's kind of like this guy goes to the castle. All right, this happens. Now Dracula leaves the castle. Now he goes after Lucy. Now he goes after Mina. Van Helsing comes in, and whether it's the stake to the heart or sunlight, Dracula dies. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So it was. This one was the sunlight. This crazy fight where I'm like, okay, also, is Dracula like, shouldn't he be stronger within the setup of that world? Because Peter Cushing was holding his own, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm like, Peter Cushing's a fucking badass too, you know, and within the realm of this film. And that was kind of it. So it was, the experience for me was not, for example, like, I really like Nosferatu the Vampire, the Herzog film. So
Mm-hmm.
I really like the scene of where Klaus Kinski is going against Harker, and it's just freaky when he gets in his space. Or the scene where Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu is in the room with what's her name, Ajani, and she just looks so fucking beautiful,
Yeah.
and the way she's lit, and he looks so grotesque, but that contrast is just super striking. Or I like elements of the set design or the romanticism of the Coppola film, even though it's also like silly.
Yeah.
The candlelight, that aspect. I like the Gary Oldman cartoonishness of that. This was just more of a like, it's almost, you're watching something out of nostalgia, but I mean, in your case, you tell me if you felt like this.
Mm-hmm.
It was a nostalgia for something that you haven't seen,
Yeah.
but it's a vibe that you're already familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
and like, on some level. And so you're just kind of sitting in that nostalgia. And it's more about that than it actually is about the film. Because the film, it's almost like it's to me, it's more about what the film represents and the page that it turned on the character and the story, rather than the actual movie itself.
Yeah, but that's hindsight, and that's how it has
I mean,
played
that's all
out.
we have.
Well, you still have to
That's
look
all
at
we
it in
have.
the time. So my thing though is that I watch it, imagining what it must have been like in '57 when this became a concept that they wanted to tackle again. Let's say you found
Sure.
the right Helsing, you found the right Dracula, probably the greatest Dracula to ever follow Bela Lugosi. And maybe he would have been even better than Lugosi if Lugosi had never done it. It's that argument that we've had about, not even that argument, but the discussion we had about how good a film is Casino how good a film would
Goodfellas.
Casino have been if Goodfellas had never been made? Casino would be elevated. It's a simple, I think that's factual. With this though, I do get the sense that Lee is there to have a good time. Peter Cushing is kind of feeling it out, but the director, whoever that was, is just phoning it in, because it's exactly like what you said. The tension is not being built in the scenes that precede the action. The action is exciting because it's well done, and it's thrilling to watch that animal quality of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing basically fulfilling his destiny as a vampire killer. And I love that about it. But I definitely get the feeling that if everything else before, because there's a lot of really good shit here that could have been amplified, and the emotional level could have been exaggerated and brought up. And I think it would have been a better film if you had had a director with a greater vision, who was more emotionally invested in the story that he was shooting. I put this on the director. I really do think that it's a failing of the studio in putting together something that I get the impression that those who were involved, writers, producers, and directors, fell back on the popular recognition of Dracula. Because remember, at this point, you had Bela Lugosi, then you had Dracula's Daughters, then you had House of Dracula, then you had the whole milieu of the Universal horror family, including Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, all of that, until it became parody, like you would see in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is Bela Lugosi's only other performance as Count Dracula. I get the feeling that this film is relying on the legend rather than myth building in its own sense. I mean, they do a couple of things where they start to argue about recreating the story. Harker being basically a soldier on a mission to kill Dracula. Cushing's Van Helsing arguing about whether or not the vampire can turn into a bat or a wolf, can change forms. There's a lot there that simply just doesn't get explored. And I think if they had been willing to do that instead of just relying on the power of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, you would have had a much better film. These films are fondly remembered, but sometimes we remember things better than they were. And everybody who talks about the Christopher Lee Hammer films, I get the impression that they remember these films better than they actually are because of the overpowering presence of Christopher Lee.
Yeah, and then that goes back to kind of what I was saying is like we're looking at the cultural impact,
yeah,
more than the actual film.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm cool with that because it's just kind of like, it's interesting to me that just the way it turned out. Like, but it's one of those things that it's it is what it is. You know what I mean? Like, that's the way it ended up. That Christopher Lee was the one to look. There's a lot of Draculas that I didn't talk about. I only talked about 6 Draculas, basically. And there have been many more that we're not talking about. Whether that's spoof, Jack Palance, like other ones that have played Dracula-like characters, or actual versions of Dracula. It'll be interesting also to see Christopher Lee over the years reprise that role and see how that changes and see how he develops. And how late was the last one? What's the last one, in the late 70s probably?
I think the last one was Dracula 1972. I might be wrong about that, but he played Dracula 10 times, but 7 times in the Hammer films. That's what I read. With Horror of Dracula, this first film, Dracula or Horror of Dracula, being the best of the bunch. Now that's disappointing. But I think that as each film progresses, and I'm going to have to talk to my dad about this because he's a big fan of Christopher Lee as Dracula, I think that the performance is going to get better. Not to say that this is not a great performance. He's great. But I have a feeling that Christopher Lee's performance will become more, I think he'll he's either going to invest more in it and make it a bigger Dracula and make it a bigger part, or he's going to start sleepwalking through it. And I don't imagine Christopher Lee is going to sleepwalk through this performance. However, whatever direction the films themselves go in, I'm confident believing that Christopher Lee is going to get better and better in each film. At least I hope so. But I'm interested in taking that journey.
I'm interested in that, and also just seeing his career, looking at the career. Like, I'll be interested in seeing a documentary on him.
Oh, I'd love to see a documentary on Christopher Lee. Yeah,
to see, you know what I mean? Some of these different films. I saw a clip yesterday from, I don't know what it's from, but it's him going back and forth with fucking what's his name? The Voice and the House of Wax. What's his name?
Vincent Price.
Thriller. Vincent Price.
Mm-hmm.
They're going back and forth, being real bitchy with each other. They're both old, and it's like all of that baggage, all of that, and they're just going back and forth, and it was just cool. So to see something like that, to see him get to the Christopher Lee that, and then, you know, even something like Star Wars where he's like, no, he's Count Dooku, you know what I mean? And it's a nod to that, and we know what's happening, and we're like, yeah, that's fucking cool.
Yeah.
It adds to the cultural. It's just one of those cultural Easter egg type of things, you know what I mean? Because it's not just any guy playing Count Dooku. It's one of the Draculas. Mm-hmm. One of Count Draculas is playing Count Dooku, and it's the voice, it's the look, the stature, literally, and figuratively. So
Christopher Lee is definitely one of those that I need to invest in a biography. I need to go out there and I want to find out more about this man. I want to hear the stories. And I mean, I know some of the stories. I know that he turned down Loomis in Halloween, and it was one of his great regrets. And although I think that would have been a mistake for him to be cast in that role, and I think we'll talk about that on a further episode, a later on episode. But it would be interesting to see the things that he was looked at for, because I think you reach a point. There are certain actors that create a persona, or at least they have a persona latched onto them. Christopher Lee is one of them. Christopher Walken is the other. Where in a weird way, their talent gets overridden by the cartoon of what a lot of people view them as. It would have been nice to see Christopher Walken. I mean, it would have been nice to see Christopher Lee have the same kind of use in films as a Max von Sydow. You know, von Sydow could go a lot of. For some reason, I think of von Sydow when I think of Christopher Lee. I don't know why, but I think of Christopher Lee. I think of von Sydow playing the devil in Needful Things, brilliant. But then I see him in one of his later performances, like Pele the Conqueror, Pele the Hero. We both love that film, whatever that film was. Yeah. But if you haven't seen Martin Scorsese's Hugo, Christopher Lee has a significant role in that film. He wasn't simply a horror icon. He was a tremendous actor. And it would have been nice to see other directors expanding on what he was capable of, instead of just painting him as the ultimate villain. I would have. I mean, he's Sauron in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He's But I would have liked to have seen him play a grandfather role. I would have liked to have seen him play a father. It's going to be really interesting because to go into his with a actor of his stature and filmography length, there has to be some outlier films, wouldn't you say? Something where somebody took a chance and said, let's cast him against type. I want to see those films. I want to see that.
Yeah, something else, something different.
I don't want to see him as just the Bond villain. Yeah, I want to see him. I want to see him as the father, the grandfather. I want to see him as a young man, surviving the bullshit of whatever era he was growing up in. I find him infinitely watchable, and I'm glad we watched this film because I feel like movie watching at its best forces you to go outside of what you might already know. And basically, I'm rambling, but you discover a director you like, so you start to go into their filmography, and then you start to go into their influences. I'm ashamed to admit that I know very little, that I know so much less than I thought I did about both Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. This film has made me want to deep dive into that world, discover more, and I have no doubt there are going to be disappointments, but I have a feeling there are going to be some great, exciting surprises. I might be wrong, but I don't think that's the case.
It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. There we go. That's buymeacoffee.com/WatchRickRamos. This episode goes to someone. Thank you very much. See you next time. More horror. More horror throughout October. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.